Morning. Welcome to everyone. We're happy to have you. I'm Sandra Jordan with Family Planning 2020 and would like to obviously welcome you and hope that you enjoy our extremely important discussion today. Building resilience to advance development outcomes is crucial, and the family planning and climate change communities must come together to make this happen. This webinar is going to be drawing on the expertise of folks here in the US and in Uganda and Malaysia to make the case for such integration and to provide strategies that the family planning policy, advocacy, and practitioner communities can utilize to potentially access new funding for family planning through projects that receive multilateral funding for climate change adaptation in low and middle income countries around the world. I'm delighted that we have so many people that are interested in this topic, and we anticipate a very lively discussion, and we hope that this will whet your appetite and lead to continued conversations and funding opportunities for the program. I'm going to turn it over, but before I do, I want to just quickly review the run of the show with you. The webinar room is, we have a chat room, and if you have questions, please type them into the chat room and we will get to them at the end of everybody's presentations. And what we'll do is take your questions, and if you intend them for a particular person, do put that person's name on it, and we'll make sure they get the question and answer it towards the end. What we have it will be a short presentation to introduce the subject, and then we have our panelists who will move forward into their experiences in working with this. Then there will be some questions from the moderator following the presentations, and then questions will be answered after these panelists have spoken. So I want to turn it over now. I want to turn it over now to Kristen Patterson, who's with Population Reference Bureau. She will be the moderator for the program. And just to give a quick introduction before I turn the program over to her, she's the program director at Population Reference Bureau of People, Health, and Planet and International Programs, where she focuses on connecting human and planetary health. She joined PRB 4 years ago this month. She has more than 20 years experience working at the nexus of community development, health, and conservation. Her previous positions include managing external affairs for the region of the Africa region of the Nature Conservancy, working as a USAID Population Environment Fellow in Madagascar, and conducting research on farmer-herder conflict in Niger. And I had one other thing. We were hoping also to welcome Dr. Saeed Shah from Pakistan, and he unfortunately has had a work commitment has interfered, so he won't be able to join us at this time, but hopefully in the future we'll have more webinars and he'll share his experience. So Kristen, would you like to take over?
Thank you, Sandra. So Population Reference Bureau is very eager to share this work, and we hope that this brief and the accompanying report will be very useful tools for the family planning and reproductive health community, as we seek to collaborate with the climate change adaptation community to develop holistic, community-centered ways to adapt to climate change. So I would like to introduce Kathleen Mogelgaard. She is a senior fellow with the Population Institute and an independent consultant with over 20 years of experience in research, policy, and teaching on sustainable development challenges and solutions. Kathleen has participated in international climate change negotiations on behalf of Population Action International, the U.S. Climate Action Network, and the World Resources Institute, and is passionate about advancing women's reproductive health and rights in the context of climate change solutions. It was a pleasure to collaborate with Kathleen writing the brief. Kathleen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kristen, and greetings, everyone. Many thanks for making the time to join us for a discussion of this important topic. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of our terrific speakers, as well as the insights and questions from many of you on the line. So next slide, please. In this presentation, I intend to briefly address three main questions. First, what are the links between family planning and climate change adaptation? Second, what are the latest developments in climate change adaptation finance? And third, how can I or my organization begin to engage in climate change adaptation strategies and finance mechanisms? Much of the information in this presentation is drawn from the PRB report and policy brief that Kristen mentioned, and links to these documents have been shared with you in the webinar invitation, as well as in the chat function of the webinar software today. So first, a quick definition of adaptation. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the foundational international climate change treaty that countries agreed upon in 1992, they define adaptation as adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. So these actual or expected climate change impacts include things like rising temperatures, drought, flooding, extreme weather events, and sea level rise. And adaptation is what we as society do to try to adjust to these impacts. Our attempts to survive and perhaps even thrive in the context of these changes. The Paris Agreement, negotiated in 2015, sets a long-term goal for adaptation, and that goal is to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability. This is noteworthy because it was the first time that an agreement in climate change included such a goal alongside goals related to mitigation of climate change or action to reduce emissions that cause climate change in the first place. All of this signals that the world is really beginning to understand that addressing the climate change challenge is about more than finding cleaner energy sources. It is also about figuring out how to cope with the impacts that we are already experiencing, and those impacts are expected to grow even more challenging in the future. So as the world has been grappling with the challenge of adaptation, questions continue to be debated about what kinds of activities and interventions count as adaptation and therefore should be eligible for climate adaptation finance. What kinds of activities and intervention can contribute to goals of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability? Does family planning matter for climate change adaptation? The answer is a resounding yes. There is growing evidence that demonstrates that the ways in which meeting women's needs for family planning has a multitude of benefits for adaptation efforts. These are laid out in detail in the policy brief and the report, and the pathways for these benefits are outlined here on this slide. When women's needs for family planning are met, women and their children are healthier, and this is a fundamental building block of resilience to climate change impacts. When women's needs for family planning are met, women become more empowered, and this opens up greater possibilities for them to effectively engage in adaptation efforts. And couples who are able to avoid unintended pregnancies tend to have smaller families, and this limits household demand on climate-sensitive resources like food and water. And finally, over the long term, when couples are able to avoid unintended pregnancy, population growth will be slower. And slower population growth reduces pressure on local natural resources and results in fewer people exposed to climate hazards. Now, as I mentioned earlier, adaptation is increasingly recognized as a critical part of the global response to climate change. And as a result, funding for adaptation activities is growing globally. Such funding comes from multiple sources, including foundations, bilateral donors, and multilateral finance institutions. For the purposes of our discussion today, we're focusing on multilateral sources in particular, and institutions such as the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund are among the key multilateral providers of finance for activities designed to help vulnerable populations adapt to the impacts of climate change. So let's take a quick look at these two funds. The Green Climate Fund began operations in 2015 under the guidance of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the largest multilateral climate fund. Current financing is 3.5 billion US dollars, and with pledges over $10 billion. One thing to note about the GCF is that this is an important space to watch at the moment. Discussions over the GCF's operations recently have become quite political. Not only have the large pledges from the United States come into question due to the positions of the Trump administration, but there continue to be questions that need to be worked out related to the functioning and governance of the fund. And this has resulted in recent delays in proposal approval and the disbursement of funds. Another key multilateral climate fund is the Adaptation Fund. This fund is a little bit older. It began operations in 2009, also under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. To date, it has channeled more than $438 million to adaptation and resilience activities in 67 countries. One noteworthy thing about the Adaptation Fund is that they pioneered a direct access funding modality that allows national implementing entities to directly apply for and manage funds, independent of international institutions like the World Bank or UN Development Program that are typically involved in these adaptation efforts. So now that we know a little bit about the vital role of family planning in contributing to adaptation efforts, and we know a little bit about the multilateral adaptation finance mechanisms, you may be asking yourself, how can my organization engage in climate change adaptation? In the next several slides, I'm going to quickly review 4 strategies that you can use to begin to chart a path for engagement in multisectoral adaptation strategies that could be eligible for adaptation funding. So first, draw the connections and build the evidence base. Funders and potential partners in the climate change community require evidence-based justifications for programmatic approaches in their funding proposals. And building on the existing evidence base, which we've outlined in the policy brief and the report, we can continue to document the vulnerability reduction benefits that come with greater access to voluntary family planning. Things like improved health, enhanced food security, poverty alleviation, and women's empowerment. Next, reach out to your country's designated authority. Designated authorities serve as the GCF and adaptation funds' main points of contact in each country, and these individuals play a critical role as a gatekeeper in proposal development and approval. In many countries, there are also national implementing entities, and these are institutions that are accredited by the GCF and the Adaptation Fund to submit proposals and receive funding. Not every country has a national implementing entity, and those countries that do typically have only one. Their role is pretty critical. They select partners or executing entities to implement adaptation projects. This is really critical for us who are interested in this linkage because executing entities can be government agencies, community organizations, or the private sector. They do not need to be accredited by the GCF or the Adaptation Fund, but what they do need is to be in good standing with both the designated authority and the national implementing entity. So the names and contact information for designated authorities and national implementing entities are available on the websites of the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. And reaching out to them is a great way to have a first step in the direction of establishing those connections and relationships that will lead to the development of, that could lead to the development of multisectoral projects. So the third strategy, very quickly, is to engage in your country's National Adaptation Plan process, the NAP process. So the national implementing entities that develop adaptation proposals are required to undertake stakeholder engagement processes to identify country-driven adaptation priorities. And I really want to emphasize that for these funding mechanisms, there is a heavy emphasis on the need for adaptation activities and priorities to be driven from the countries themselves, to be identified as the country's own priorities. And engaging in a national adaptation plan process in your country is a real opportunity for family planning and reproductive health organizations to identify family planning and reproductive health as an important element of reducing vulnerability and increasing adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities. Inquiring with your country's environment ministry is a way to learn more about the status of the national adaptation planning process in your country. Most developing countries at this stage either are in the process of developing a NAP or already have a NAP developed. I want to emphasize, though, that this is a very country-specific effort. The NAP process looks different in every country, and doing that groundwork to understand where the national adaptation planning process is, what the current status is in your country, is a good way to understand how you might be able to engage as a stakeholder in that process. The fourth and final strategy that I wanted to go over really quickly is identifying potential partners. So in developing multisectoral proposals for climate change adaptation, it's critical to consider partnering with others who have experience in the adaptation space. Learning about the current adaptation initiatives underway in your country is a really useful first step. The designated authorities that we talked about earlier can be a terrific source of information on the institutions who are engaged in adaptation efforts in your country. And the GCF and Adaptation Fund websites include detailed information on the adaptation projects in each of the countries that they serve. If you're able to access the GCF and Adaptation Fund websites, do a quick search, and you can find documents that provide an overview of the institutions that are involved in adaptation in your home, in your country, the roles that they play, and begin to get some ideas about the potential for partnership in the future. This final slide is a photo of elite women runners in the 2015 Boston Marathon. I chose this image for the final slide because I think it represents some of the key ideas that I hope I've been able to get across in this brief presentation. First, that integrating family planning into climate change adaptation strategies and accessing adaptation finance is not a sprint. It can't be done quickly, and it requires the hard work of getting to know the adaptation landscape in your country and building networks and partnerships. But doing so can result, I believe, in sustainable and lasting solutions to some of our most daunting development challenges. And as ever, I believe that empowered women, like the women in this photo, will lead the way in these efforts. I want to thank you for your time and attention in listening to this presentation. I am really thrilled that we have two terrific panelists who are going to provide some insights on their experiences in these topics. I would encourage anyone who is interested in exploring these issues further to reach out to me. My email address is included in the first slide of this presentation. Please feel free to be in touch if you would like to discuss these issues further with me. I would love to hear from anyone on this call who has experience in this area at the country level and would be able to share their perspectives with me as I continue this work with the Population Institute and other partners here in Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen, for a great presentation. I think it's vital for the family planning and reproductive health community to really understand the 4 key strategies that were laid out in the brief that Kathleen went over. Many of us in the reproductive health community used to think that family planning could be funded as a standalone activity under climate adaptation funding, and now we know that it really needs to be framed as one very vital part of a multisectoral approach to climate change adaptation. So I want to remind participants to send any questions via the chat box as we hear from our 2 speakers. So first I would like to introduce Hui Lim. She is with ARROW in Malaysia, which is a regional nonprofit women's organization based in Kuala Lumpur that was established in 1993 to create a resource center to enable women to better define their lives. Hui works on climate change and sexual and reproductive health and rights of women. She has written numerous articles on women's SRH and nutrition, as well as publications on interlinkages of population and development. And she also writes on SRHR and climate change. ARROW is an accredited observer organization with the Green Climate Fund, and Hui is ARROW's focal person for the GCF. Our second speaker is Charles Kabeswa, who works with Eco Uganda. The Ecological Christian Organization is an indigenous, non-governmental organization registered in Uganda that is working toward the realization of sustained livelihoods for marginalized, underserved, and vulnerable groups in Uganda by increasing the capacity of local communities to adapt to and implement livelihood options that are resilient to climate change. They also help enhance the capacity of local institutions and community groups to support local adaptation and disaster risk reduction initiatives. Charles has excelled at working across ministries and can provide helpful insights into how he does this. So we will start with we. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone from Kuala Lumpur. In my presentation, I will be covering these few topics. Can you show the overview slide, please? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll be covering what is Green Climate Fund, which we normally call GCF, why Aero becomes an accredited observer organization to the GCF, what is Aero's role in the GCF, and how GCF links family planning or reproductive health to climate change. So firstly, what is GCF? GCF, Kathleen has already presented earlier in her presentation. I'll just give a brief introduction or probably recap from what Kathleen has said. Most listeners, if you are interested to find out more about GCF, it would be best to visit their website. But for a brief introduction, the GCF was established in 2010 at the Conference of the Parties, COP16, to serve as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, under Article 11. This fund has the largest fund compared to other climate finance funds. For example, Adaptation Fund, Climate Investment Fund, and Global Environment Facility. The function of the GCF is under the guidance to the COP to support policies, programs, and projects in which the GCF has to report to the COP annually. GCF is based in Songdo, South Korea, and this fund aims to help developing countries limit or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change through promoting a paradigm shift to low emission and climate resilient development, especially for countries vulnerable to climate change. The GCF provides funds in the form of grants, loans, equity, or guarantees to countries, development agencies, and multilateral development banks to implement mitigation or adaptation or cross-cutting projects or programs. In terms of why did Aero decide to become an accredited observer organization to the GCF? It's a pretty simple story, very straightforward. Every year, Aero's program staff has a meeting at the early stage of the year with our program advisory committee to pick their brains as we plan for the year's activity and program. So in early 2017, at the program advisory committee meeting, one of Aero's program advisory committee members, Titi Sontoro, she suggested that Aero should explore the GCF space. So we applied to be an accredited observer organization. We got accepted by GCF to be an accredited observer organization. And from then onwards, we started to engage in the GCF board meetings along with other accredited CSOs in the GCF. What is Aero's role in the GCF? That is the third point which I'll be touching on. Aero is the first sexual and reproductive health and rights organization accredited as GCF observer. Now there are actually two organizations, that is Aero and the Danish Family Planning Association, which is also Aero's partner. Aero has participated in monitoring the GCF board meetings since early 2017. Annually, GCF holds 3 board meetings. At each board meeting, board members discuss issues pertaining to the operationalization of the GCF Secretariat and the GCF policies and procedures. The decision to approve proposals submitted by countries is also the prerogative of the board. Prior to the board meetings, every time, the CSO observers will hold a CSO strategic meeting to strategize interventions for agenda items in the board meetings. Arrow will always participate in these strategic meetings. Though at the moment, Arrow's engagement is not directly linked to sexual and reproductive health and rights, however, we have the opportunity to engage or advocate for inclusion of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 3, which is good health and well-being, and Goal 5, that is gender equality. Both these goals are actually linked to SRHR if you look at its targets. The intersectionality or interlinkages are apparent in country funding proposals, particularly adaptation or cross-cutting projects, as these projects have some development or social co-benefits component. For example, what Kathleen had mentioned, food security, livelihood, access and control of resources such as land, water, technology. These have impact on women's health, particularly their sexual and reproductive health and rights. So one role Arrow plays at GCF is to review the project proposals submitted by countries to GCF for funding approval. Arrow focuses especially on the gender assessment or analysis and gender action plan, including the budget of the project, to make sure that activities that are proposed are relevant and will benefit and empower the grassroots women and do not harm them. And Arrow is also part of the CSO Observers Small Working Group on Gender Policy and Action Plan. We are also in the small working group on biomass. We are greatly concerned about biomass energy because it impacts women's health, livelihood, access to food, clean water and land, and also biomass energy contributes to air pollution. Talking about the small working group on gender policy and action plan, the GCF is in the midst of the process of reviewing its gender policy since middle 2017. Arrow, being part of the small working group on gender policy and action plan, is involved in public input submissions, drafting interventions on gender policy for board meetings, analyzing the many draft versions of gender policy, working closely with the GCF Secretariat's gender team, and reaching out to some board members to advocate for progressive, sustainable development, coherence, and human rights-based gender policy and action plan. Arrow has also successfully, until now, included health and well-being into the text of the gender policy. We are now nearing the final leg of the process and advocating for stronger human rights language before the policy is adopted. We, the CSO observers in GCF, are keeping our fingers crossed on this. If this progressive gender policy and action plan is adopted by GCF, it is considered the most progressive gender policy and action plan ever adopted by any climate finance entity. This policy and action plan will greatly benefit, empower, and provide safeguards to vulnerable women at the local and country levels, as well as open up possibility for development components, including family planning or reproductive health or sexual and reproductive health and rights, to be in project proposals that will be submitted to GCF in the future. And the last point on how does the GCF links family planning or reproductive health to climate change. As of now, GCF has not linked family planning or reproductive health to climate change. Therefore, there's a lot of work that family planning or reproductive health organizations out there need to do to convince GCF on the interlinkages between climate change and family planning or reproductive health. I will talk more about how family planning or reproductive health organizations can play their role in this later on. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Hui. That was really interesting and very helpful. Now it's over to you, Charles.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for all the listeners. My focus is going to be more of bringing the country context on how we've been working to integrate family planning and reproductive health into climate change or resilient work within Uganda, but also touching a little bit on what is happening in East Africa. So it is going to be as well kind of sharing our policy wins that we've managed to put in place, and also trying to share some kind of a way forward on where we want to be next. And I will start by introducing our organization, which has been in existence since 2005, and that is Ecological Christian Organization. And our thematic areas, we fall under natural resources governance, climate change and resilience, as well as ecosystems management and restoration. We also work with, we don't work alone, so we have quite a number of networks where we are accountable, and also where we bring together some kind of collective voice when it comes to the national advocacy issues, and also linking and learning. So one of them is Climate Action Network Uganda, which has a membership of 200 member organizations. It is hosted and chaired by our organization here. We are also members of Uganda Population Health and Environment Network in Uganda, which is coordinated by the East African Minister of East African Affairs, but under the National Population Council of Uganda. And we are also members of IUCN. IUCN is International Union for Conservation of Nature, and other number of networks like the Environment, Natural Resources, Civil Society Organization Network. Yeah, the next slide, please. Yeah, so we have been involved in a number of initiatives and interventions that link reproductive health and climate change, and we have done that both in the policy and practice. One of our major interventions have been with the population of health and of people and environment in the Lake Victoria Basin. That is an organization that integrates health or reproductive health and as well as environment, and we have implemented that with other partners like Pathfinder International and other technical backstopping from some of organizations like Population Reference Bureau and others. But also we have a number of initiatives that are tailored towards building community resilience and also reducing vulnerability of mothers and children. And some of them include integrated risk management. That one integrates climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and health. And that is under Partners for Resilience. But also we've had a number of campaigns which are supporting visible and a strong representation of population dynamics on the climate agenda. And some of these, like my colleague has said, we've been trying to engage the COPs, since I think the past 12 COPs we've been participating, and with other members of open working groups on the same agenda, either inside events or some kind of policy briefs on trying to push that there is visibility of the population dynamics within the climate change negotiations. And also, we also engaged in a number of initiatives where we brought together some African organizations, and we kind of formed a forum called the Population and Climate Change Africa Forum. And that one has been on since 2009, trying to bring together the discussions of how we can influence both national, regional, and international dialogue and agendas to try to integrate population and climate change. And in country level, we are very, very vibrant through the Uganda Population Health Environmental Network to push the campaigns on different targeted policy frameworks, and also any policy review processes in Uganda. I will be sharing some of them in the coming slides. Next. Yeah, we have also, like, some of the quick wins we have seen in family planning integrated into the climate change policy for Uganda, and actually even beyond that, it was costed. Family planning in particular was costed in the climate change policy custody plan for Uganda, which for us was a big step. And our organization and our networks have been highly involved in the development of the East African Community Population Health and Environmental Strategy, that is 2021, and also engaging well within the Lake Victoria Basin Commission Population Health and Environmental Operational Plan for 2020, as well as the development of Uganda National Population Health and Environmental Strategy, among others. We also have, being a Christian-founded organization, have a strong linkage with working with our religious leaders on a campaign called Caring for the Creation, to become good stewards, but also linking population dynamics within the messaging. And that one has been on for, I think, the past 7 years, trying to bring churches to embrace some of these initiatives. We have done a number of documentaries which are helping in our advocacy work, but also written a number of policy briefs and abstracts and papers which link climate change, national determined contributions, and sustainable development goals. And these have backed up our evidence from the practice. And this always come in hand whenever we are influencing their policy or any actions on the ground. Next. In terms of key policy outcomes of our work, a text is has already been incorporated within the Uganda national or national determined contributions, which we refer to as NDCs. And it is one of the strategies that the government is committed to support the initiatives and the programs that integrate population and climate change. We think that is a big step, and we continue pushing this because now we are midway on that agenda of trying to implement the national determined contributions for Uganda. In addition to that, in East Africa, there are 2 countries that have that as a strategy, including Rwanda. So maybe the rest of the countries, it might become as a recommendation to try to engage in the next review process. And as I already said, we have already a text and a custody intervention within the climate change policy implementation plan in Uganda, which is kind of giving a priority to family planning. And there's even a budget that has been attached on the implementation custody plan for that policy. We have also pushed the text within the new the revised or reviewed National Environmental Management Policy for Uganda, as well as the National Population Policy draft, still not finalized yet. But of course, I've already talked about the Uganda National PHE strategy, which is also very relevant to connecting climate change and family planning. And we have done a lot to inform the East African regional PHE strategy, as well as informing the minimum package for population health and the environment, for especially which is being championed by the Lake Victoria Basin Commission. So most of these documents we have tried to package in terms of whenever we engage in the policy review process to ensure that there is need to give priority or to focus on the family planning and reproductive health, or in the general population dynamics within these policy frameworks. And going forward, we all know, Catherine and others have already hinted on the national adaptation plan or planning process which are ongoing. We also have the same in Uganda. A little kick started at one point, but it's now on hold. I think the government is trying to consolidate some kind of funding from the UNDP and UNEP. But of course, for us, it is still our agenda. The fact that we have succeeded bringing FP and RH within the previous policy or relevant documents like the climate change policy and the NDCs, it is still high on priority to ensure that we engage the NAP process, so the National Adaptation Planning process, to embed the family planning and reproductive health along the adaptation planning for the country. Then also, already my colleagues have talked about the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund for FP. If we don't engage now, when the governments and other international and the national stakeholders are struggling to make this happen at national level, more ensuring that the commitments are translated into actions, then it will be a big missed opportunity. So our plan, again, we need to see the collective effort as Ugandan stakeholders to ensure that we see some allocation of FP and RH within the Green Climate Fund. I know it's not very easy, but I think the engagement process and the dialogue process will be able to make this happen. And then we think it is always very important to keep on advancing and scaling up the practice of integrating population health and environment, or integrating family planning into all our climate change work. And I think this helps us to generate evidence, especially to engage further. And you know, most of the policymakers in Africa here, not only in Africa, but they want to see what has worked. So they need evidence. One of the colleagues has already hinted on the evidence space, which is very, very critical. And we have other policies, and there are more environmental related policy reviews which are ongoing in Uganda. Currently, we are taking the lead with other CSO, civil society organizations, to review the wetlands policy and the act. And there is a stronger connection with the wetlands degradation and then the population. So it is going to be more of a quick agenda for us to integrate as well, because it has just kicked off this year, and we think by end of year, mid next year, we should have a reviewed wetlands and the wetlands policy and the act. And the other step is still continuing generating evidence. Already this has been overemphasized, but also the issue of partnerships. You know, this kind of integrated kind of approach, both in a policy and in a practice, requires a lot of bringing different stakeholders or multisectoral team together. So we need to still continue working in coalitions and networks, and also use the power of numbers also to influence, especially the GCF, Adaptation Fund, and also the NAP process. But also in terms of practice, it is very, very relevant that you have like health partners and environmental partners working together, like it has been in the past effort, like for the health of people and the environment in the Lake Victoria Basin. Then also, we need also to build on the momentum as countries are struggling to implement the Paris Climate Agreement and the SDG agenda. It is important that especially civil society get those as like a talking kind of put family planning and reproductive health on the banners to ensure that the integration of that is justifying how quickly or easily we can fast track the development goals and also meeting the climate agenda. So already I think my colleague has talked about continuing the visibility within the COPs on population and climate change discussion, either through side events and also kind of advocating with a number of high level kind of discussions within the Conference of Parties and the UNFCCC meetings. So I think these are still very critical issues to take forward, and that ends the discussion of, the presentation of, I think, yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Charles. Your work in Uganda is really a great model for other organizations to tap into. I just wanted to briefly highlight for those of you on the webinar who may not be familiar with PHE or the population health and environment approach, that's a type of community-based development that often takes place in rural areas with high levels of biodiversity, where multiple sectors are included in one project. So those PHE projects typically include reproductive health, primary health care, as well as natural resource management. So thank you again, Hui and Charles, for those really good presentations. And now what we would like to do is do some Q&A with both of you. So the first question I have is for Hui, and we'd like to ask you, what advice would you give an organization that works on family planning and reproductive health and hopes to engage with and receive funding from the Green Climate Fund?
Okay, I will just put a context to my response, okay? Oftentimes in climate change space, policies, programs, and projects do not take into consideration gender responsiveness and inclusion, as well as women's human rights, including sexual rights and reproductive rights. Even when there are gender-related activities, ironically, these activities could not be implemented as there is no specific budget allocated. I have to say, listening to Charles' presentation, Uganda is leading the way, and I hope other countries would follow. But usually, this is what happens. There is usually a clause in a document saying, request that the actions of the Secretariat called for in this decision to be undertaken subject to the availability of financial resources. I repeat again, subject to the availability of financial resources. So, therefore, it is essential for us to ask and demand for financial commitment if we are serious about strengthening the gender responsive means of implementation, particularly finance. If we are advocating for strengthening of the implementation of gender responsive climate action, which is actually in line with the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, which we call UNFCCC GAP. This UNFCCC GAP was adopted at COP23 in Bonn last year, and it is a major milestone for us women. Therefore, I would encourage family planning or reproductive health organizations to apply to be accredited observer organizations to the GCF. At the GCF level, these FP or RH organizations can, for example, engage in GCF board meetings through the GCF CSOs Observers Group. They can monitor to make sure that the policies and processes and the implementation of programs, activities take into account gender consideration that GCF has committed itself to. These FP and RH organizations can also review the project proposals submitted by countries, just like what Aero did, especially those project proposals that come from their country or their region, because they are the organizations that know best what is happening in their backyard. And we are not financial experts, but our focus can be on gender component, which at times have health component, but it might not be fully developed and do not have family planning or reproductive health part. So these FP and RH organizations can actually highlight any concerns regarding the project proposal or even suggest ways to improve those project proposals, because some accredited entities that submit these project proposals are actually open to feedback and I would say engagement with the CSOs. For example, UNDP, they are open to engagement with us and they are open to feedback, of course, constructive feedback. Another thing which the FP or RH organizations can do is, whenever there is opportunity to advocate the evidence-based linking reproductive health or family planning to climate change. Charles has mentioned this as well. It is important that country-level studies and data is actually being used to advocate, because until and unless board members or policymakers see this data and evidence, they are not going to move at all. As of now, GCF has not received or funded any funding proposals with family planning or reproductive health component. However, I like to reiterate what Kathleen in her publication wrote. So I'm going to read this, okay, what she wrote. There may be an opening for family planning or reproductive health from a gender perspective. If applicants could demonstrate that a lack of family planning or reproductive health was a barrier to women's participation in project activities, particularly as a means of women's economic empowerment, investing in efforts to reduce this barrier could be considered. So again, using gender perspective as our entry point. This, I believe, presents an important rationale why it is essential for family planning or reproductive health organization to engage in the GCF, like what Charles has mentioned. If you're going to miss this, it's going to be a missed opportunity for all of us. Yeah, that's my response.
Thank you, Hui. That's really helpful. And I fully agree with you that the Gender Action Plan is indeed a great first step. And let's hope that the GAP will, lead to more engagements on SRHR in the future. I also wanted to mention that my colleague at PRB, Laura Cooper Hall, wrote a blog post on PRB's website about the GAP. I think it came out in December last year or January this year. So that's something that people can also check out for more information about the GAP. So next we have a question for Charles. As Kathleen mentioned, we know that many of the major climate adaptation finance institutions are interested in funding projects that are related to countries' national adaptation plans, or their NAPs. So could you talk about your experience with the NAP process in Uganda a little bit more, and share any advice that you have for civil society organizations who would like to engage in the NAP process in their own countries?
Yeah, thanks. And just to give you a status of the NAP in Uganda, we have just started to plan for the development of the NAP. So in the Ugandan perspective, it's not late, but part of the NAP has been finalized, and that is the National Adaptation Plans for Agriculture, that is which we call NAP Agri or NAP Agric. That is the NAP for agriculture. But the general NAP is like in many countries we haven't fast tracked this, and for me, which I think creates a good opportunity on how to position the population or family planning agenda on the NAPs. And in terms of doing that, we still need stronger kind of drawing connections, like some of you have already hinted or emphasized, because most of the people who are in a climate change agenda, most of the policymakers, some of them are from the conservation side of it or even planning side, and many times they think that when you talk about family planning and maybe reproductive health, there's a stronger disconnect with the resilience and adaptation, which is not true. So I think it is high time all countries that have the opportunity to engage in now the discussion to have good evidence of what the connections are, and also try to go into some kind of intensive dialogue with these lead officers or lead people who are working on the NAPs, and we need to ensure that we are part of the process all the way. But also, it is very important that you don't go as a single entity organization like Eco Uganda or maybe Pathfinder International, PRB. It is better that we make some kind of a coalition, some kind of collective kind of advocacy using the networks like Climate Action Networks and others These people are willing to listen, but we have to do it now. We don't have to wait, because along the way it might not be easy to reverse. But also, it is also common here that if you are engaging, it might not be the best approach to just say we are advocating for maybe integration of family planning. It would be connecting, like what my friend here has said, that you need to try to connect, to show the value add in terms of resilience of women, in terms of women participating in decision making, in terms of women engaging highly into adaptation activities and others. And this has to be well documented and well presented in a number of formats to bring these stakeholders on board. So for me, I think that is very, very, very important. But also countries like Uganda, where you already have family planning and reproductive health embraced within the national policy processes, like the climate action network, climate action, climate policy, and also the national determined contribution. It is very important to package, because now these ones are more of commitments, and we want to see how those policy commitments are translated into actions. So we are justifying that the NAP process, or the implementation of the NAP, or the NAP planning, should be the means to implement what already the government has committed in these policies and others. So there are quite a number of avenues, but some of those for me, I think, are very, very critical. Partnerships, drawing connections, and also reminding the government that these are already planned from the different policies, and they want to find the means of implementing this on the ground.
Thank you, Charles. I think working as part of a multisectoral coalition to engage in the NAP process is really helpful advice. So I have a question next for Hui. What actors exist? What other actors exist that organizations can work with to access climate finance? So, and how can organizations work with these allies to push for recognition of multisectoral projects in climate adaptation finance?
Thanks, Kristen, for the question. Okay, to explain, the multisectoral projects in climate adaptation finance are ongoing, and it's well recognized. However, having said that, it's multisectoral between ministries or departments of environment, climate change, natural resources, forestry, agriculture, labor. The family planning or reproductive health or health sector is missing. And most of the time, gender is also missing. So as an entry point, I would suggest that or recommend family planning or reproductive health organizations engage with the country national designated authorities, NDAs, which Kathleen has mentioned earlier in her presentation. These NDAs are actually the country rep for GCF. So what FP or RH organizations can do is to advocate to the NDAs and other government departments or officials for gender inclusion and responsiveness. That means including development components such as family planning or reproductive health or its interlinkages in project level gender action plan that would benefit grassroots women in country project proposals that will be submitted to GCF. In order to incorporate family planning or reproductive health or its interlinkages in country project proposals, first of all, there is a need to create awareness to these country level NDAs and also non-family planning or reproductive health organizations at the national level or grassroots level so that there's buy-in from them. This is very important. And then to connect the NDAs with other grassroots family planning or reproductive health community-based organizations who are impacted by the project that will be implemented or who is already affected by the project. And if there is opportunity, at an early stage of developing project proposals, family planning or reproductive health organizations can engage together with those community-based organizations, which I've mentioned, to find entry point to participate in the development of country project proposals, to include family planning or reproductive health or its interlinkages component. Engagement of stakeholders through a consultative process at all levels of the project is something which the NDAs need to adhere to, because in the GCF, it is in the guidelines for enhanced country ownership and country drivenness. So until and unless we, the organizations and CBOs, know our rights and that as stakeholders, this is what we can do, we should push for this. And also talking about alliance, as I mentioned, it is not enough for us to work together. We also need to advocate to non-family planning or reproductive health organizations. And it can be environment organizations or even gender organizations, because there is a need to build collaboration with them so that there's buy-in and there's more support, because at this moment in the climate change space, the focus is very scientific and technology. It's a lot on how do we make sure that the temperature do not go above 1.5 Celsius. So everything is very technological. But then why are we saving the planet for? It's for human lives, right? And it's for women's health and rights as well. So we need to make these environment organizations and non-FP or RH organizations to see that, hey, women's health, women's reproductive health, and women's family planning are important. We need to take it into consideration. We are not diluting the dialogues or discussion at climate change space, especially at COP. So we need to continue to collaborate. We continue to build awareness with those who have not come to understand or have this awareness yet. Yeah. So I think it's important for us to build bridges with other organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Hui. And I just want to remind all of our speakers to keep your responses, to 1 or 2 minutes so that we can ask more questions, because we have a lot of questions that have come in for you all. So next I have a question for Kathleen. The question is it possible to get more information on the national adaptation process?
Great, thank you for that question. And I am so delighted that we have been getting so many questions in the chat, and please continue to submit your questions. I think we're hitting on a lot of really important topics here. And I'm really glad that we got this question about the National Adaptation Plan process, because as you've heard from both Charles and Hui, this is an important dimension of how adaptation activities and plans unfold at the country level. And the NAP process is incredibly influential in targeting climate change adaptation finance at the country level. So just a few more quick words about the background of National Adaptation Plan processes. The National Adaptation Plan process initiated in 2011 globally, and this was agreed to by parties under the UN Climate Change Agreement. And so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does provide support to least developed countries in developing their national adaptation plans. Some of you may have heard of NAPAs, National Adaptation Programs of Action, which are from about a decade ago. And those were plans that identified the most immediate and urgent adaptation needs that countries have. The NAPs are intended to follow up on the NAPAs, and the NAPs are meant to focus on medium and long-term adaptation needs, which to me, when we're thinking about women's reproductive health and family planning, this is critical to long-term, medium and long-term development success. So this is a really good opportunity, as we've heard from both Charles and we, for reproductive health and family planning organizations to be part of this process, to be stakeholders in this process, and to get in at the ground level to be able to share information and the evidence about how meeting women's reproductive health needs is central to reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity and meeting those climate change adaptation goals that are enumerated in the International Climate Change Agreement. As I mentioned earlier, the NAP process is unique to each country. It can be a little bit difficult to find information online about a country's NAP process, but a couple of quick resources that might be helpful to folks. There is a website that is hosted by the UNFCCC called NAP Central, NAP Central, CENTRAL. And there are, I think, about a dozen countries that have posted documents about their national adaptation plans on that website. There are also global organizations that provide support to national adaptation planning processes in various countries. One of those is the NAP Global Network, and that's a good place to peruse their website to see if you can find information about your country's national adaptation planning process. But most critically, I think the best way to learn about the national adaptation plan process in your country is to reach out to your designated authority. And again, the designated authorities for the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund are listed on the GCF and Adaptation Fund websites with their contact information. And they will be plugged into the status of the national adaptation planning process in your country. And it's a good opportunity to connect with them, to express your interest in being part of stakeholder engagement processes that are happening under the NAP process, and to really begin to establish that relationship and to begin to get plugged into that process. I hope that addressed the question that was coming there, and if I'm happy to follow up offline if there are additional ways that I can be helpful on that.
Thank you, Kathleen. And yeah, I think the point of the one-on-one connections and building the relationships at the country level cannot be understated. So next, we have a question for Charles. So having followed the NDC process in Uganda, how do you think we can get to a place where more countries include family planning in the adaptation section of their NDCs? Because at the moment, it looks like only Solomon Islands and Kiribati integrate lack of access to family planning or contraception in their NDC, even though 23 NDCs identify population growth as a link to their adaptation challenges.
Yeah, that's very important. And the NDCs have gone halfway. So there's an opportunity for reviewing the NDCs. I think that's 2020. And for me, I'm looking at this as a big opportunity because we've got countries like I mentioned, Uganda and Rwanda. Some of the strategies, it is actually one strategy of supporting programs and the initiatives that integrate population and the climate change. But you know, when you dig deeper into the exactly what they mean, some of this kind might lose focus along the way when it comes to the direct niche of what we want to see, especially giving family planning and reproductive health a priority. So I think the countries that already have that, we have to work in partnership to ensure that we don't lose that focus when we are reviewing the NDCs. And then the countries that have not integrated, then it is an opportunity for us to start the dialogue right now, and then by the time of reviewing after 5 years, we almost gone to 3 years, and that would be a good opportunity for us to still engage. But as I said, we have to have enough documentation about the connection is to ensure that it is given high high priority on agenda. So it is an issue of timing, but I would think that the discussion has to start now.
Thank you, Charles. Yes, it sounds like definitely it's important at the country level to know where your country is in the timing process, since the NDCs are, last for 5 years before they're revised and renewed. So next I have a question for Hui. Could you please elaborate a bit more about how family planning advocates might ally with gender advocates in the climate finance space? So is that happening now in some form? And if not, how could family planning actors use the progress being made to further the progress of family planning inclusion in climate finance?
It is actually happening at the moment. Arrow, being a SRHR advocate, actually allies with the WGC, Women and Gender Constituency of the UNFCCC, which is a gender advocate entity. So it is happening, but I would say we need more players from the FP advocates part. And we did manage to have little win last year. I wrote a blog in Urongo on that. So every year for COP, the WGC would have demands. And last year, one of the demand is actually for SRHR. So it has become an individual standalone demand last year. And it has been picked up by the president of Marshall Islands as well, where she actually mentioned it in her interview in The Guardian that women's SRHR needs to be prioritized as well in climate change context. So yes, it is happening, but it is we need more players. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hui, for those insights. Next, question for Charles. Given your work, what grade, like a grade in school, would you give Uganda on its advances in linking environmental and family planning issues? Could you give us an idea of how well people have received your message, particularly policymakers?
Yeah, it is positive. And I think that's how we have managed to push that on the agenda. But also, we still have work. It is still work in progress, because as I mentioned, most of our outcomes are more into still on the planning side, even policy-wise. So someone might think that director, what is the government doing? Because now the next step, we need to see that these policy commitments are also translated into some actions on the ground. And the issue of money is now the next the step that we want to see, because we want to see government committing to implement what they have committed in the policies. And now I would be able to kind of, I can say we have moved the step, but we need to go further to ensure that we put a scorecard to what level are the policy instruments and the frameworks on population and the climate change are translating to real actions on the ground. And I think that's what we are yet to see. But now when coming to Uganda, I think there has been some kind of opportunities where the government has picked up through, especially the National Population Council, which coordinates the population health and environment network. And we see some now budgets coming in from the government to coordinate that kind of dialogue and engagement. And on our side, it gives us good avenues that there is more of assured platform to engage the government and using some kind of a collective action, because this unit brings different stakeholders together. So we are progressing well, but there's need to ensure that what has been put on paper translates into actions, and the funding is very critical.
Thank you, Charles. That's very helpful. Now I have another question for Hui. The question is, one of the participants is wondering if there are any examples of larger scale adaptation projects that have included reproductive health and family planning, in comparison with the generally smaller scale population health and environment projects.
As of now, I am not aware of it. I would think probably Charles could also provide input on this because he is more familiar at the national level.
Okay, Charles, do you know, as far, and I'm looking at Kathleen, but we don't know of any large scale adaptation projects that have included reproductive health to date. Thus, the utility of this work is to help pave the way for that to be done in the future.
Yeah, most of the work we are doing is to pave the way because Uganda has got a huge fund, but unfortunately, it is more of, it doesn't include family planning. But now this has been more of setting the readiness, some kind of readiness and a commitment from the government, which we think that the next time are very critical for us to keep engaging and pushing for this. Because as I said, we want now beyond the planning, you want to see the actions of, and that's actually the question that the audience is asking.
Thank you, Charles. And then we had another question about the status of the Gender Action Plan, whether it's already been completed, and I can answer that. Yes, it was launched last year at the COP, so in November, December 2017. And I don't have a website URL in front of me, but I'm sure that you could, if you Googled the Gender Action Plan, you would be able to find it online. So a next question for Kathleen is, I know that this webinar is focusing on multilateral adaptation funds, but do the panelists have thoughts on bilateral adaptation funding that already is or may be open to including reproductive health and family planning as part of multisectoral adaptation projects?
Thank you for that question, and I'm hoping that our panelists may also have some perspectives on this question. It's a little trickier to track the individual bilateral funding agencies and their activity in this arena. We are aware of a few smaller projects here and there that have been funded by USAID, for example, that have brought together elements of climate change adaptation and women's health. And it's encouraging to see those examples, both in terms of programmatic interventions. We're aware of some work that was done in by WWF in Nepal to bring, to me, it's a really interesting case in Nepal because as they were developing their local adaptation plans of action, stakeholders in the community identified a lack of access to family planning as something that was a barrier to women's participation in developing adaptation plans. And so we're able to incorporate enhanced access to family planning and reproductive health services as part of the broader comprehensive project to advance adaptation planning and the implementation of those plans. So that was really exciting to see that. We're hoping that there will be some documentation of that work that can be shared because as both we and Charles have mentioned, being able to document the ways that these issues have come together already in the field and to share that information with decision makers can really help build the case for why these linkages are important and that they actually work. That's a key example from a bilateral aid agency that I wanted to share. Before I turn it over to see if Charles or we have anything to add on that, I guess the other point that I would like to make is that I think even with bilateral funding agencies, they are looking to countries' national adaptation plans to see what their priorities are and what activities and interventions countries think are going to be most effective in reducing vulnerability and achieving adaptation goals. So again, to me, this is places the emphasis on organizations getting engaged in their national processes and becoming stakeholders in adaptation planning processes at the national level, because they can be so influential in guiding funding in the future, regardless of the source it's coming from, whether it's multilateral aid agencies or bilateral aid agencies or private foundations. I think all funders are looking toward what countries have identified as their own adaptation priorities and needs. So just quickly to see if Charles or Hui have anything to add on that in terms of making the case for bilateral aid that would be supportive of these linkages. Anything to add on that, Hui or Charles?
Yeah, actually, I agree with your last statement, because you know, the bilateral and multilateral, they are all not dictating on what to do in the countries, but they are guided by the country priorities. So if in the priorities of the governments or within different countries, they are not like a kind of giving family planning or reproductive health a priority, then it might not be, it might be kind of out of the context of their funding programs. So I would think that we may not have a very strong, maybe a big project or program on the ground, but now this is the time that we need to make sure that we push family planning and reproductive health priorities for the countries, especially the adaptation plans. Otherwise, out of that, then it becomes something that the other big funding agencies might not give a priority, because it is still not a priority for countries. So I think it is very important to have that in mind, and I think it is now the way to go, and why some of these discussions are coming up. It is good timing for that to advance the dialogue.
Thank you, Charles. Hui, do you have anything to add to what Charles and Kathleen just said?
No, I have no additional comments on that.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question about the population health and environment networks that exist in many of the countries in East Africa in particular. And there's also a very strong PHE network in the Philippines and in Ethiopia and in Madagascar. I would just share from my perspective, you know, PRB was involved in creating those networks back in 2007. So many of them have been in existence for a long time. And I think because those networks often have good linkages with policymakers and you know, leading officials in different sectors in each country, that working through those networks would be a good way to, you know, advance this dialogue at the national level. So we have about 5 minutes left, so we're going to wrap things up, but I would like to just share that at the International Conference on Family Planning in November, which will be held in Kigali the second week in November, PRB is hosting a mini track and a side event on population, environment, and development. And that is a space where we hope that, you know, conversations on this topic can continue. And I would like to thank everyone for participating, and I'll turn it back over to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you all panelists and all participants. We really appreciated your deep involvement and interesting questions, and I know excuse me, Kathleen, Hui, and Charles enjoyed the conversation with you, and I thought this was such a powerful learning experience and opportunity to find new sources of funding and new sources for coalitions, that I hope you share this enthusiasm and encourage you to share the information and these links and such with all of your networks. We'd also like you to explore these issues further, and just want you to know that we will be posting this webinar and resource materials to our website, and we'll also cross-link with PRB and the Population, Health, and Planet part of their website that has all these good resources on it. So we will have that, so you'll be able to find it easily. And I think there are ways also that you can ask questions in the site. So we're happy to get the questions to them, and we also will post both Kathleen's and Kristen's email addresses so you can become pen pals. And okay, I think I've said everything, and again, we thank you, and we look forward to providing in the future. FP 2020 is very interested in the links with population rights and empowerment and environment. And so we'll be exploring the nexus of these issues further going forward, and hope to get Kathleen and Kristen and all of you back in the future to talk about what you've learned in the interim and through other projects and such. So let's plan to stay in touch on this issue. So thank you again, and goodbye.